My parents had a wonderful and happy marriage, and because of this, my younger days were great. That all changed, however, when my father was KIA in Iraq in 2005. Since my folks had been high school sweethearts at 16, his loss hit my mom very hard. For a long time, she spent most of her days and nights in bed. Luckily, I was already approaching 14 and capable of taking care of myself. Not 1 second did I hold her reaction against her. We all deal with the death of a loved one in our own way. Her long days in bed would end about 9 months after my dad's death, when a friend of my mom convinced her to go out with her to her favorite bar. That day would lead to a long, hard road in which she would almost lose her life, and both of our lives would be forever altered. Within a week, my mom would bring home her first boyfriend. He would become the first of many men she would pair with large amounts of alcohol in a vain attempt to kill the pain of my dad's loss. Over time, her personality would change drastically. She became far harder, and I can't think of one time in which I remember her smiling. Then the day I feared would come arrived. My mom moved in one of the boyfriends. Daryl was a lowlife that worked days at a motorcycle repair place and spent his nights drinking as much as possible. For whatever reason, Mom thought he'd be great marrying material. I guess alcohol does destroy brain cells, just like they say. Anyhow, they got hitched a few months after he moved in, and that's about the time everything started to fall apart. Daryl would show his true self within a week of the marriage. He and Mom stumbled in one night from some bar and began arguing. She said something that made him mad, and he backhanded her across the face. Rather than destroy him that second, she would apologize to him after sobering up the next morning. This was just the reaction he must have been hoping for. The abuse would escalate from that point, and it became normal to see Mom with a black eye or split lip. Despite my begging, she wouldn't get rid of him. I heard the same excuses over and over. He's only mean when he's drunk, and I push him too far when I am. In the end, it's my fault. I eventually gave up and began focusing on saving enough money to get out of the house. Luckily, Daryl ignored me for the most part. He'd said many times that he'd had no interest in being a parent to me, and that was just the way I liked it. Ultimately, the logical result occurred the year after I'd moved out. Daryl and Mom had one of their usual arguments, and this time, he almost took it too far. I would get a call one day at work from the hospital saying my mom had been in a terrible accident. Only when I got there did I find out it was far from an accident. Daryl had beaten Mom so badly that she had died once in the ambulance. A noise complaint from the neighbors was the only thing that saved her. That incident was the one that finally got her to leave him, and with Daryl out of the picture, I moved back in with Mom to help her with the bills. Things were a little rough while Mom healed. Daryl did try to get her to come back to him through text, but she managed to stand fast. Just as it was starting to look as if though she was going to be back on her feet without him, he caught her in a moment of weakness and convinced her to come over just to talk. On her way over, she did the one smart thing that would save her life. That night I was working and received a text from her saying she was heading over to the old house, the one that Daryl was living in. It was clear to me this was a bad idea. Once I managed to fill my boss in on the situation, I raced over to stop her. She was already there when I pulled up outside. As soon as I turned off my engine, I could hear people yelling at each other. I rushed into the house in time to witness my mom jump on Daryl's back. She was punching him on his head, and when he turned around to pull her off, I noticed a big bruise on her face and a bloody lip. It wasn't hard for him to throw her off. She was lying on the floor yelling curses at him. Each word she said was slurred, and this was when I realized she was drunk. Neither of them noticed me at first. They continued yelling at each other. As this happened, I watched Daryl reach into a drawer and pull out a pistol. He fiddled with it for a second and then pointed it at my mom. In her state, she foolishly laughed at him and said that he didn't have the spine to shoot her. A few seconds later, he fired the first shot. The shock of seeing this caused me to scream out, and this was when he finally realized I was there. When he saw me, he grinned and aimed the gun back at my mom. There was no way I could let him shoot her again, so I charged and tackled him. As we fell, a second shot went off, barely missing her. Fortunately, he was so drunk he had dropped the gun, but once he located it, began crawling over to get it. I knew when he had it, he'd shoot me next. Out of nowhere, I yelled out that I'd called the cops and that they were on their way. This was a lie, of course. When he heard this, he stopped and stared at me, trying to see if I was telling the truth. I put on my best serious face, and it must have worked. He reached down and grabbed the gun and helped himself to his feet. I winced when he stood up, but instead of shooting me, he turned around and stumbled out the front door. I quickly crawled over to my mom. Miraculously, she was still breathing. However, she was bleeding heavily. Dialing 911, I was told by the dispatcher that someone had already called in gunshots and the officers were on their way. No more than 3 minutes later, they showed up with the paramedics right behind them. They rushed her to the hospital, and after a long surgery, she survived. Daryl being drunk was probably the thing that saved her life. At the distance she was, he could have easily blown her brains out. When it comes to Daryl, however, he wasn't quite as lucky. The police caught up with him on his motorcycle a few miles from the house. After repeated demands that he drop his gun, he raised it and they emptied their guns into him. The moment I was told was like a load of bricks had been lifted from my shoulders, and I relaxed the first time I had in a long time. I can't pretend that his death made me sad because honestly, I'm glad he's gone. Our life had been a nightmare since he came into it. Once Mom had recuperated, my parents and I convinced her to enter alcohol treatment. It went very well, and she's been sober almost 2 years as of me writing this. Last month was the first time we visited my dad's grave since the funeral, and despite it being a sad day, I think it is a good first step in my mom's grieving process. A process I don't think she's ever managed to complete. However, I believe with a lot of help from myself and the rest of the family, she will be able to finally deal with his loss and learn how to handle it without the booze.
So I've never told anyone this story, because how the hell do you admit to your family you were almost abducted when you were 11 years old? It was 2005 and a usual summer day for me. I got up about noon, went on a bike ride with my brother, then came home and spent most of the remaining daylight in our above-ground pool. I was relaxing and intent on spending the rest of the night playing video games. I decided to check my MySpace profile really quickly and spend some of the energy on my games there. But as I was finishing off my Dog Wars energy bar and about to close the browser to head downstairs to play some PlayStation, I got a sudden friend request. Ali, 13, who was 3 hours away from nowhere, Kentucky. I clicked the name because I didn't know an Ali, not even an Allison, or really any girls whose name began with A. And she was pretty. 11-year-old me just scoffed. Why would she want to be friends with me? And I almost ignored it. Almost. I accepted the request, and with not much else to do, I sent her a message, asking a simple question like, should I know you from somewhere? She told me we'd not met, but that she was friends with one of my friends, Mike. I checked out her profile and saw that she and Mike had shared a lot of common interests and were on each other's friends list, so what she was saying checked out. I didn't message Mike to ask him about her, but I was a very trusting young boy and had no reason to believe she was anything but what she said she was. For the next few weeks, I'd talk to her every night, for no less than 3 hours usually. We'd just chat about school, music, television, typical kid stuff, and I didn't really think anything about it, than just being MySpace friends. That is until she said that she liked me. I sort of laughed it off, thinking she just meant like, in the way friends like each other, but she clarified that she meant she had feelings for me and wanted to meet me in person. She lived pretty far away from me, so I didn't really see how this would be possible. I knew my parents were not about to take me to some girl I'd met online, and quite honestly, I wouldn't want them to. They were decent parents and all. I just never felt I could talk to them about these kinds of things, so I just sort of shrugged it off. I told her it'd be hard for us to meet, because as much as I like riding my bike, a 3-hour bike ride to a part of the state I'd hardly even seen before was not something I'd be comfortable doing. She was very understanding and said that she at least wanted to talk on the phone, instead of just messaging. I agreed, but told her never to call my number and to always let me be the one to call her, because I didn't want my parents picking up and asking questions. She understood, so I called her. The first time I got her dad, and he gave me a gruff, "Who is this?" It was weird though, because I had the phone with me at the computer and told her I was calling, and she said she had the phone with her as well. But I didn't think anything of it and told him it was James and that I was looking for Ali. He told me to hold on a second, and there was a rustling sound on the phone, like someone trying to make it sound like they were handing it over. Again, I didn't really think anything of it, when then I heard a high-pitched, "Hello?" We talked for a few minutes, then she said she had to go because her dad was expecting a call as well. I shrugged it off and told her to just message me so we could talk again later. We kept messaging back and forth for a while, and before I knew it, it was almost the end of summer. She was unhappy still not having met me in person, so she posed an idea. She said there was an end-of-summer event going on at a lake near my house, and she said that her and her family used to go there sometimes, and that she could probably talk them into going there for the event. Now, my family usually went to the area on the 4th of July, and having just had a nice time there, it wasn't too hard for me to convince my folks as well. A few nights later, she let me know that they had agreed, and that she was super excited to finally meet me. She told me she was going to kiss me as soon as she saw me, which made me blush, so I tried my best to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal, like I was some stud who'd kissed plenty of girls before, but I wasn't. I was totally pumped to finally kiss a girl, and it was only a few nights away. I had a hard time sleeping the next couple of nights, and I stayed up most of the night talking to Ali. We were both excited and couldn't wait to meet. It was very much a magical experience. The night before, I think I stayed up until 8 a.m. talking to her. So the day had come, and after an early afternoon bike ride and a short swim, our family loaded into the car, and my dad took the truck so that me and my brother could take our bikes to the lake with us. There was plenty of bike trails, and we always enjoyed riding there. But I told my brother I wasn't going to be hanging with him the whole night, and would only ride with him a little bit before I went to meet another friend. He wanted to tag along like little brothers do, but I quickly convinced him he didn't want to hang out with me because the kids were mean, and I was only hanging out with them because of one of them. He thankfully didn't ask any questions after that. About an hour later, and the sun was starting to set. My brother said he was going back to meet with our parents anyway, as he didn't like riding in the dark. He already had a habit of crashing as it was, so when I ventured off on my own, it was without hindrance. I made my way to the picnic area Ali had agreed to meet me at, and I sat on one of the tables with my bike resting against the side. I sat for a long time, so long that I started to get worried and was ready to leave because the fireworks were about to start and Ali hadn't shown up yet. I stood up and jumped down from the picnic table, and just as I did, a rusty old white pickup truck pulled up beside the tables. The man inside reached across the cab to roll down the window and gave me a weird smile, telling me that he was Ali's dad and that he was going to take me to her. I started feeling strange about the situation, so I just gave him a blank stare and said, "What?" He turned the engine off, thinking maybe I couldn't hear him over the sound of it, and climbed out of the truck. "I said I'm here to take you to Ali. Hop on in," he said, opening the passenger door and motioning for me to climb in. The truck was full of garbage, and it looked very dirty. I could smell oil and other things coming from the truck, as I gave a crooked look and told him I wasn't going to get in. As he grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the truck, I realized pretty quickly what he was all about. "Get in the damn truck," he barked, squeezing my arm so tightly that I thought it was broken. I pulled away, practically giving myself an Indian burn as I told him I was leaving. But he came after me, so I did the only thing I could think to do to repel a grown man twice my size, and probably thrice my age. I reared back and kicked him square in the genitals. I didn't bother to wait to see how he'd handled the blow, and hopped on my bike, pedaling with all my might back to the other side of the lake where my family was. He didn't follow me. At least I don't think he did. And if he had, he might have seen my dad, who was a rather large guy, and definitely not someone you'd want to fight after he'd had a few beers. I never saw him again, and when I got home and went to message Ali to tell her what a jerk her dad was, the profile was gone. I saw Mike just before school started, and he said he had no idea who Ali was, and didn't even remember adding her on MySpace. It wasn't until some years later that I realized how terribly close I'd come to being abducted, and God knows what that man wanted to do to me. Ali's dad, let's not meet again.
I work the evening shift at a hospital that is believed to be, at least by 90% of the staff, haunted. I'm part of the 90%. You see, there have been horror stories about every building, floor, and pretty much every part of the campus. I mostly wander around alone as a housekeeper, and that makes it much worse. At least when my mind is on it. Usually I try not to think about it. My personal experience was back in the ultrasound wing of the radiology clinic. By the time I get around to that area, the lights automatically dim, and there isn't anything I can do about it. It's always spooky back there at night, so I usually just get done with what I need to do and move on. The place is kind of shaped like a J, like a long hallway that curves around. On the inner side of the curve, there's a dressing room that opens up to a mammography suite, and then opens again at the top of the J. If you're standing at the bottom of the J, you can see through the doors of both rooms to the top of the J. I was standing back there, trying to bag on my cart, when something moved in the corner of my eye. I looked up, and through the dressing and mamma rooms, to the other doorway opposite me. I vividly remember it like it was yesterday. A male figure walks past the door right before my eyes. I literally watched it amble slowly across my field of vision. There are no male ultrasound techs here, and it was not my boss. It looked like it was wearing dark clothing, had long hair, but was definitely male. I snapped out of it and ran over to see if some freak had wandered in, but there wasn't anyone. I grabbed my stuff and ran out without finishing all the work, 'cause screw that. Another story, which isn't my personal experience, comes from the second floor of the hospital. The second floor has nothing but offices and computer labs, all adjacent to one corridor that spans the entire length of the building. On one end is a set of elevators, and on the other, a pair of double doors that opens into a computer lab. This floor is infamous for being the domain of something the workers affectionately call Matilda. The first story I heard about her was from a co-worker who knew someone who worked on that floor. He came in for whatever reason doing office stuff and was going home late one night. He walks out of the office and starts towards the elevators when something catches his eye, so he turned towards the computer lab. At the end of the hallway, there was what looked like a patient peeking into the lab. He walks towards her and asks her who she is and what floor she came from. She told him she has no face. The office guy is frozen in place, scared out of his mind. He wants to run away, but he doesn't want to turn his attention away from whoever or whatever is staring him down at the other end of the hall. What does he do instead? He closes his eyes as tight as he can, and after several seconds or minutes or however long it was, he opens them, and she's gone. He says he's never ran as fast in his life as he did that night, straight outside without ever looking back. Another Matilda happening was when one of the managers left a tape recorder going in his office, also on the second floor, because he wanted to see if he could catch any weird noises or voices. The next day I'm walking by his office with a co-worker, and he calls us in there and plays the recording to see if we hear it. After forever with nothing, a faint voice comes in and says, "Turn it off." That was spooky as hell. I work in an office, and used to work an overnight shift from midnight to 8 a.m. On my lunch breaks, I would often take a nap. I work on the 14th floor, but that late at night, there are very few people around, so I would go to the vacant second floor and catch a few Z's. It was completely silent down there, with the exception of the occasional outside street noise. Also, they turned the heat off during the winter, so it would be cold down there. I would use my coat as a blanket. Perfect napping temperature. The lights down there were motion sensor and would turn on by themselves as you walked down the hallway. There was a long hallway that went around the building that was used as a waiting area for a conference room. This waiting area had comfortable chairs that made a perfect little bed if you pushed the two together. I had a perfect spot behind a pillar. The only bad part about my spot was the lights there were wired backwards, meaning they were always on until you walked into that area and then they would turn off. I would just cover my eyes, but by the time the timer turned the lights back on, I was usually out anyway. So this night, at around 3:30 a.m., I pushed my chairs together and went to sleep. Almost instantly, something weird happened. I heard footsteps approaching the corner to the hall I was sleeping in. Along with footsteps, I heard keys jingling. I hear the footsteps get closer, and the keys get louder. Any minute now he would see me and stop, or keep walking. Either way, I would hear him pass and know I could relax. The problem was after he turned the corner, the footsteps and the keys continued, but they never got closer. It sounded as though he turned the corner and stopped and proceeded to march in place. I kept waiting for him to pass, but the sound stayed the same distance away. I didn't want to lift my head because honestly, I shouldn't have been down there sleeping and didn't want to get in trouble. The light was also still on. After a few minutes, I decided to see what the hell this guy was doing. Was he making noise to wake me up? Messing with me? I figured none of my supervisors would walk around with the keyring, so I probably wasn't in danger of getting in trouble. I tried to lift my head, and I couldn't move. I struggled to roll over as I was sleeping on my side and finally was able to force myself onto my back. I cannot move my arms or legs or speak or open my eyes beyond a slit small enough to see light. And that's when the lights turn off. The footsteps and keys, which hadn't stopped marching in place, began heading in my direction. I tried desperately to sit up or open my mouth or eyes, but I couldn't, and I felt a heavy weight on my chest. The keys were on top of me, and I could distinctly feel two large hands on my chest holding me down. It felt as if someone had climbed on top of me and was holding me down with all the weight on my chest. I start to panic. I try to yell, but I can't speak. I try to move my arms to get the key man off me, and my arms won't move. I'm completely hopeless. I can't even open my eyes to see what was on top of me. It felt like it went on for an eternity, but it was only probably a minute or so. Finally the weight lifted, and my eyes opened part way. There was nothing on top of me, or even around me. The footsteps had gone back around the corner, and the keys jingled off in the distance. I lifted my head, and to my horror, the chairs were no longer where I had pushed them. I always put them behind that pillar so people walking wouldn't see me, but now I was laying in the middle of the hall. The chairs pushed away from the pillar and window. The lights were still off, indicating that something had been moving recently. I started to hear a low droning sound in my ears, a low electric hum. I'm sweating like crazy. I grabbed my jacket to wipe my face, and when I pulled the jacket away from my face, I was back in my original spot. The sound was the lights overhead blazing away in the silence. No footsteps, no keys. I grabbed my things and went back upstairs. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, or anything like that, and I've experienced sleep paralysis before as a side effect of medication. I'm pretty sure it was just a nightmare mixed with some form of sleep paralysis, but Jesus Christ, it felt so real and was horrifying. I later told a co-worker about what happened, and he said a worker who helped build this building had killed himself here during construction, and some people reported seeing the ghost of a construction worker in empty rooms and walking the halls. We both laughed about it. A ghost? Ha! Yeah, right. He said, "People are stupid, man." They said they've even heard keys jingling and everything. Morons.
First, let me say I come from a somewhat unconventional family. We are all a little weird or wacky in our own way. Sometimes we get along great and sometimes not so much. On Christmas Day, my parents and I usually stay home and don't see any of our extended family. However, this past year we decided to go to my grandmother's house. This is a little different because my grandmother and I have a very rocky relationship with one another. I have overheard my dad mentioning stories about my grandmother and my now deceased grandfather that bordered on child abuse. I remember being really young and my grandparents screaming at me for the smallest things and my parents abruptly taking me home. But anyway, I'm in my 20s now and my father decided since it was Christmas, we could give spending the holiday at my grandma's a chance. There was a healthy conversation about politics, which I thought for sure would change the mood, but surprisingly did not. After several hours and a nice dinner, everyone made their way to the living room for coffee and to just hang out on the couches. I left my coffee on the kitchen table and made my way to the back of the house where the only bathroom was. I washed my hands, fixed my shirt, and walked out of the bathroom. When I walked into the hallway, I was greeted by my grandma, who was just standing there staring at me. I said, "Hi, what's going on?" And I tried to keep walking, but she wouldn't move. Now this is a narrow hallway and you're only fitting one across. "Excuse me, please," I said, semi-annoyed, yet still she did not budge at all. Finally she spoke up and said, "What do you think you're doing?" She sounded nervous and almost a little angry. "I was just going to the bathroom," I said, starting to get uneasy about the entire situation. She started to poke my chest and said, "Where is he?" At this point, I was beyond confused. I told her I had no clue what she was talking about. Where's who? I finally shoved past her and started to make my way down the long hallway. That's when it happened. I heard her scream like a banshee and chase me down the hall. I turned around and she lunged at me with a small kitchen knife. She was trying to stab me. She just kept screaming, "Where is he? Where is he?" At this point, she had fallen to the ground trying to take me down with her. After a minute of this, my father finally came running in with my aunt and lifted her up. I was too scared to use any force because I didn't want to hurt her, but I also didn't want to get stabbed. I was so angry and upset I started to grab my things and told my family I was leaving. As I made my way toward the door, she walked back into the living room and said in a calm voice, "Oh, where are you going? You haven't even finished your coffee." I just left and didn't even respond. This woman, my grandmother, tried to stab me, and I still have no idea why. I found out several weeks later from my cousin that after my father and I left, my grandmother cried for hours and was basically inconsolable. She didn't know why we were so angry and left so abruptly. Clearly, my grandma had some sort of episode that night that she can't remember. But there are so many unanswered questions like, who was she referring to? I haven't seen or spoken to her since. My dad did try to reach out and explain to her why we left and why we won't be coming back, but she doesn't believe he is telling her the truth when he transcribes the events back to her. The worst part about all of this is that this will probably be the Christmas that I always remember the most.
Back when I was in college about 7 years ago, I had to move from an apartment to another last minute because, well, I was a lazy college student and hadn't made any plans. My parents were in town, so we were looking for something quick. Fortunately, we found something pretty cheap and somewhat nice right in front of the university. They were thrilled. I was just happy this was all over. So I moved in this kind of 4-room basement, which was already furnished. They said the last tenant cancelled last minute, and I only needed it for the 3 months of the summer, so he was giving us a great deal. The first room was the main room, which consisted of a living room and a little table to eat. Immediately on the right of it was the kitchen and the bathroom. The bathroom was on the left, and there was some kind of weird and small hall/connection joining it to the living room. Since the start, I always kind of felt uneasy about that bedroom for some reason, and preferred to sleep in the living room since there was already a comfy sofa bed in there and there were no windows in the bedroom. Throughout the semester, I felt countless times that someone was watching me from the bedroom when I was alone, either watching TV or playing video games. It was weird, and every feeling to the point where I preferred closing the doors leading to the bedroom altogether. I wasn't home that much, and sometimes I slept at friends', but every time I came back it felt like I wasn't alone in that apartment. There was never any sound or sights, just a strange feeling. I spoke of it to my friends and they laughed, since I was never the superstitious kind. So I kind of brushed it off the whole time, and thought nothing of it when I finished the semester. I kind of just moved on with life. About 2 years ago, one of my friends from college texted me, "Hey, is 17 the door number you lived at in that creepy basement back at uni?" "Yeah, why?" He then sent me a picture of an old local newspaper page. He had been looking through them at the library, looking for a picture of him back in his college football days. It was the obituary section from 2009. The picture of a young and good-looking female student. Next to her picture was the picture of a door and a dress which I recognized very well. Turns out, she hung herself in her bedroom closet.
So a bit of background. I'm from a Caribbean country and all high schools here have a specific uniform to wear. I went to prestigious all-girls Catholic school and our uniform made us look like we were little girls. My school was 15 to 20 minutes away from where I lived. So I travelled with taxis to and fro. Taxi drivers would normally drop me in front of the school on mornings, but when the school finished at 2:30 p.m, I had to walk 7 to 10 minutes to reach the taxi stand to go back home. Sometimes I would be there standing till 4:30 to 5 p.m. waiting. Right, so onto the story. When I was 16 in 5th form, I'd already been travelling for the past couple of years. After my initial hired driver quit after the first 3 years, there was a particular taxi driver who was in his mid to late 20s. I took his taxi a few times, no problem. There was always other people in it, and he was always friendly and laughing with everyone. One particular evening, I got into his car and realized I was the only passenger in it. There were others outside, waiting to get a taxi going in my same direction, yet he passed them straight. I thought it was strange, but didn't bother too much about it, until he began asking me personal questions about my family and myself, and kept asking if I had a boyfriend. He then proceeded to tell me how I looked sexy walking down the street to the taxi stand, and how he always looked at me after school. He also said he waited for me and saved a seat in his car for me every day. He even went on to tell me the kinds of sexual stuff he would do to me if he was my boyfriend. He went on like this for the entire ride, and I felt extremely uncomfortable. A couple of times, when the fear rose in me, I thought of just jumping out of the car and running away. Thankfully, he dropped me home safely, yet hinted that he couldn't wait for the next time I got into his car. The following days, I refused to take his taxi, and this apparently infuriated him. He would drive up to me while I was waiting by the taxi stand, then rev his car and speed off, then turn back and roll his windows down and stare at me with rage. This went on for a while, until a day my dad was with me at the taxi stand and noticed how the guy was acting and asked me why I didn't want to get into the car. I ended up telling him and my mum later on. They were obviously panicked, and for my A-level years, they didn't make me travel.
It was a sunny, warm day when I visited my aunt, who lives near downtown of my city, as I live on the outskirts. At around 4 p.m. I decided to return home, so I called a taxi as usual, because getting to my place using public transport is very time-consuming. So I go inside the taxi and this guy is just giving me a bad vibe. Something about him is off. I tell him the address and hope he won't be talking to me, but I'm wrong. He starts with comments like, "Why do chicks live so far away from the city?" Or, "Why are you in the back seat instead of the front?" And every time we stop, he looks at my skirt, which pulls up slightly while I'm sitting. Then some friend of his calls him on the phone and it's connected to speaker, so I hear their conversation. The driver tells his friend that he has a great girl in his car and she looks like she wants some fun. You know what kind. And as he says these things, he's looking at me in the mirror. Yeah, at this point I'm trying to ignore all that he's saying because it's making me really anxious. After he hangs up, he stops the car at a bus stop, which is very illegal, and asks me if I can pay in cash. I said yes, and to that he responds, "Can you pay me by sleeping with me?" This just infuriated me, and I told him to take me home now or that I was going to call the company and give them his taxi number and description of the harassment and breaking the law. He looked at me in a face of defiance, so I began dialing the number, and I guess he got scared and started driving again, as he didn't say a word until the end of the ride. I told him to stop next to a slightly different address, which wouldn't make him suspicious because where I live, the addresses are quite messed up, so it's easy to get lost. When I get out, I pretended to be searching my bag for keys, just to make sure he drove away. When he did, he stopped about 50 meters away from me and looked at me. I was standing there until I was sure he was gone for good, and I wasn't followed, and then went home. So although nothing creepy actually happened, it's always better to stay safe than sorry. Maybe it was a weird vibe from him. Maybe I felt scared because I was trapped in a car with him and his behavior caught me off guard. In either case, I wish I'd never meet him again.
I stopped taking the taxi about a year ago. I was 23 at the time and working as a community nurse. It was during the Christmas season and my co-workers kept on pestering me to attend one of the yearly parties at the time. I can't say I was particularly excited. I've never really enjoyed heading out to bars, especially since I've always lived so far away, and getting home was always a stressful experience. But my partner at the time lived in the neighboring city, and he encouraged me to give it a go. Getting to know my co-workers outside of a hectic day in the healthcare system was certainly tempting. He finalized my decision by telling me he'd pay for the taxi to get home. I insisted he shouldn't, but I appreciated it. So that day I got the heels on, attended the party and had a good time. After staying at the locale we rented, my co-workers asked if I wanted to join them at a bar. I was hesitant but confident that I would get home safe. Safety has always been a really important thing for me, and I've always been taught to take care of myself and to make reasonable decisions. At the end of the night, I've had some drinks. I'm not intoxicated, but I've enjoyed the night with my co-workers. One of my co-workers suggests heading to her place for the night, and to try and build a relation, I decide to go. We take a taxi and everything is fine. When I arrive at my co-worker's place, however, I rethink my decision. It wasn't anything particularly wrong. I just kind of figured it would be nice to head home to my partner, so I wouldn't have to think about the travel the next day. So I tell her she won't need to stress about setting up a room for me and everything. I head back out again and call some random taxi company. I wait for a bit before I notice a taxi driving up to the sidewalk. I make the terrible decision to sit in the front seat. The man appears to not be from Norway. He's got stubble, dark hair and dark skin. I remember he spoke with a heavy accent. The conversation starts normal. He asks where I've been and if I've enjoyed myself. After a moment, He asks me if I'm Norwegian. I've got brown eyes, dark hair, and slightly tan skin. It wasn't hard to figure, so I said no. But I was raised in Norway and considered myself a Norwegian. It was after that the conversation started turning darker. He began talking about the Norwegian drinking culture and how women behaved recklessly. He began referring to women as whores and how they would carelessly have sex with men regardless of their marriage and dignity. I kind of went along with the conversation. Insulting the guy was the last thing I wanted to do. A terrifying feeling of control overwhelmed me. While I wasn't intoxicated, I really didn't want him to have any suspicion that I wasn't in control of the situation. The longer the car ride continued, the more personal it got. "Where are you going?" "To my partner." "How long have you two been together?" "About a year." "Do you have sex often?" The question caught me off guard and I kind of shrugged it off. I mumbled, "I don't really talk about that." And a mild silence overwhelmed the car. The traffic light turned red at some point during the ride, and he asked me to turn to him and come a little closer. I'm not really sure what you do at that point, but I turned to him, in which he looked into my eyes and told me that I had beautiful eyes. It was at this point that the alarms completely went off, and I was completely convinced that I was in danger. That was the moment when I slowly began to undo my heels while the car was still in motion. I was ready to jump out of the car if I had to. It's only when I start recognizing the streets that I managed to calm myself down, that he was at the very least taking me to my destination. When he finally pulls up to my partner's driveway is when I quickly pay. My heels are already in my hand, and he doesn't get a second to finish his sentence before I bolt out of the car, barefoot, and into the house frantically. My partner wakes up and asks me what happened. The next day I spend an entire day contemplating if I should call the taxi company and complain. I question myself repeatedly, but then I remember that he called me at some point in the night to ask for my specific location, and the fear of him connecting the dots that it was me that complained about him catches me. I really regret that I never called in. I remember vividly looking down at my skirt, my heels and my top when he was talking about women in such a degrading way, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that I was precisely what he was talking about. I wonder what would have happened if I had been more intoxicated, if I had less control of the situation, or if I wasn't heading to my partner. A lot could have gone wrong that night. I vividly remember reading in the newspaper 3 weeks later that there had been a taxi incident where a woman had been assaulted by a taxi driver. A month prior, my friend had nearly been dragged into the taxi because the taxi driver was begging her to have sex with him. All I'm saying is, stay safe out there, girls. Always have a plan to get home.